The conference room on the 47th floor smelled like expensive leather and desperation. Sarah Mitchell sat across from 6 stone-faced executives from Meridian Technologies, her hands steady as she clicked through the final slide of her presentation, though her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. 3 months of preparation had led to this moment, 3 months of 18-hour days and midnight conference calls and sacrificed weekends, all building toward this single pitch that could transform her career from successful to legendary. The numbers on the screen behind her told a story that should have been impossible, a 5-year strategic partnership worth $50 billion that would merge her company's AI infrastructure with Meridian's global distribution network, creating something that had never existed before in the tech industry. She watched the executives exchange glances, their faces giving away nothing, and she knew that everything hinged on the next 10 minutes. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the 3rd time in the last hour, but she ignored it because nothing mattered more than closing this deal, not even the nagging feeling that had been growing in her chest for the past 6 weeks, the sense that something fundamental had shifted in her marriage while she'd been too focused on corporate warfare to notice. The lead negotiator, a silver-haired man named Robert Chen who'd built his reputation on crushing ambitious proposals like hers, leaned forward with his fingers steepled under his chin, and Sarah felt the room's energy shift like the moment before lightning strikes. She'd researched every person in this room, knew their career trajectories and their pet projects, and the deals they'd killed and the ones they'd championed, and she'd crafted her presentation to speak directly to each of their priorities, weaving together technical innovation and market disruption and shareholder value into a narrative that should have been irresistible. Chen asked about the integration timeline, his voice carrying that particular tone of skepticism that meant he was actually interested, and Sarah launched into her response with the confidence of someone who'd anticipated every possible question, explaining how her team had already begun preliminary infrastructure assessments and identified key synergy points that would accelerate deployment by 40% compared to industry standards. The younger executive to Chen's left, a woman who'd made her name in hostile acquisitions, interrupted with a sharp question about liability frameworks, and Sarah pivoted smoothly, pulling up a supplementary slide that outlined the legal structure she'd spent 2 weeks perfecting with her company's general counsel. Outside the windows, the city lights were beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over the downtown core, and Sarah realized she'd been in this building for 9 hours straight, surviving on coffee and adrenaline and the sheer force of will that had carried her from a middle-class childhood in Ohio to the executive suite of one of the fastest-growing tech firms in America. Her phone buzzed again, insistent, but she kept her attention locked on the executives, reading their body language like a poker player searching for tells, noticing how the CFO had stopped taking notes and was now simply watching her with an expression that might have been respect or might have been calculation. The questions kept coming, each one a test of her preparation and her nerve, and she answered them all with precision, drawing on the countless hours she'd spent gaming out scenarios with her team, anticipating objections and preparing responses until she could recite them in her sleep. Chen finally sat back in his chair, exchanged a long look with the woman to his left, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had them, that despite the poker faces and the aggressive questioning, they were going to say yes because everything about this deal made too much sense to reject, and she'd made it impossible for them to find a legitimate reason to walk away. Sarah stepped out of the conference room into the empty hallway, her heels clicking against polished marble as she finally pulled out her phone, expecting maybe a congratulatory text from her husband Michael about the smaller client pitch he'd been working on, or perhaps a question about dinner plans, anything normal and mundane that would ground her after the intensity of the last 3 hours. Instead, she found 17 missed calls and a string of messages that made her stomach drop like an elevator with cut cables. The first message was from her best friend Jennifer, just 3 words that didn't make sense. Sarah, call me immediately. The second was from her sister in Portland, similarly cryptic and urgent, but it was the third message, from Michael's business partner David, that made the hallway tilt sideways. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I tried to warn him this would blow up. Call me when you can. She scrolled down with trembling fingers, past messages from colleagues and acquaintances, until she reached a forwarded link from Jennifer with a single word. I'm sorry. The link opened to a local news blog, one of those gossip sites that track the city's business elite, and there on her phone screen was a photograph that rewrote her entire understanding of the last 6 months. Michael, her husband of 12 years, was caught mid-kiss with someone Sarah recognized immediately as Vanessa Park, his 28-year-old executive assistant, who'd started at his consulting firm just before Christmas. The photo was high resolution, taken at what looked like a restaurant downtown, and there was no ambiguity in it, no possibility of innocent explanation, just two people clearly involved in something that had been going on for longer than a single stolen moment. The article beneath the photo had been published 2 hours ago, right in the middle of her presentation, and it detailed rumors that had apparently been circulating in their social circle for weeks, speculation about extended business trips and late-night office sessions, and a relationship that everyone seemed to know about except Sarah herself. She read through the piece with a strange sense of detachment, like she was reading about strangers, noting how the journalist had spoken to anonymous sources who described seeing Michael and Vanessa together at various locations around the city, always touching, always intimate, conducting their affair in a way that suggested they either didn't care about being caught or were too caught up in their own drama to notice the exposure. Her phone rang in her hand, Jennifer's name flashing on the screen, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to answer because what would she even say? How could she possibly articulate the cognitive dissonance of standing in this hallway, having just closed the biggest deal of her career, while simultaneously discovering that her marriage had been a lie for months? She thought about the nights she'd stayed late at the office, the weekends she'd spent preparing for this Meridian pitch, the times Michael had been so understanding and supportive about her crazy schedule, telling her he knew how important this deal was, and that he'd handle things at home, and now she understood why he'd been so accommodating, because it meant he could spend time with Vanessa without raising suspicion. The hallway lights seemed too bright suddenly, harsh and exposing, and Sarah found herself sliding down the wall until she was sitting on the floor in her expensive suit, her phone still clutched in her hand, trying to process information that her brain kept rejecting as impossible. A security guard walked past, glanced at her with concern, but kept moving when Sarah waved him off with a gesture that probably looked far less composed than she intended. She pulled up Michael's contact, stared at his name for a long moment, then scrolled through their recent messages, seeing them now through a completely different lens, noticing all the times he'd said he was working late or meeting with clients or dealing with urgent business matters, and wondering how many of those explanations had been lies. The phone buzzed with another incoming call, Michael this time, and Sarah felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest, a transformation from shock to fury that happened in the space between heartbeats. Sarah drove home on autopilot, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white, navigating familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign and hostile, like the entire city had been repainted while she wasn't paying attention. The penthouse apartment they'd bought 3 years ago, the one with the view of the harbor that Michael had insisted they needed, even though it stretched their budget, was lit up when she pulled into the underground garage, and she could see his car in its designated spot, meaning he was home and waiting, and probably knew that she knew. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor took 45 seconds, and Sarah used every one of them to construct a wall around her emotions, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart, determined to handle this confrontation with the same strategic precision she brought to the Meridian negotiation. He was in the living room when she walked in, still wearing his work clothes but with his tie loosened and his shirt untucked, and the look on his face when he saw her was something between guilt and defiance, like he couldn't quite decide which role to play. Sarah set her briefcase down carefully on the entry table, removed her coat with deliberate slowness, and walked to the kitchen island where her phone screen was still showing that damning photograph, turning it to face him without saying a word. Michael ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd seen 1,000 times before, and opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah cut him off with a single raised hand, because she needed to hear him try to explain this, needed to understand what possible justification he could offer for blowing up their marriage in such a spectacularly public way. He started with the predictable script about how it wasn't what it looked like, how the photo was taken out of context, but his voice faltered when Sarah pulled up the article and began reading excerpts aloud, her tone flat and prosecutorial, detailing the anonymous sources and the timeline and the various locations where he and Vanessa had been spotted together. She watched him deflate in real time, the lies dying on his lips as he realized there was no talking his way out of this, no clever explanation that would make the evidence disappear. When she finally let him speak, what came out was worse than she'd anticipated. Not a moment of weakness or a midlife crisis, or any of the other clichés she might have been able to eventually forgive, but a confession that he'd fallen in love with Vanessa, that what they had was real and meaningful, and that he'd been planning to ask for a divorce but hadn't found the right time. Sarah felt something break inside her at those words, not her heart exactly, but something more fundamental, the foundational belief that Michael was someone who deserved her loyalty and her trust. She asked him how long it had been going on, and he had the audacity to hesitate before admitting it had started last November, which meant he'd been carrying on this affair through Christmas and New Year's and their anniversary in February, lying to her face every single day, while she'd been pouring everything she had into her career. The question that finally broke through her composure was the obvious one: why now? Why tell her this week of all weeks? And Michael's answer revealed a selfishness she hadn't known he possessed. He'd seen the news about her Meridian deal, knew that she was about to become one of the most powerful executives in their industry, and he wanted out before she got too successful, before their divorce became a spectacle that would overshadow his own career ambition. Sarah laughed at that, a harsh sound that didn't contain any humor, because the irony was almost too perfect. He'd already made it a spectacle by getting caught with Vanessa in such a public way, and now both of their careers would be fodder for industry gossip for months. Michael left that night, packed a bag, while Sarah sat on the couch watching him move through their bedroom like a stranger, evacuating a hotel room, taking his clothes and his laptop and the watch she'd given him for their 10th anniversary, leaving behind all the accumulated debris of 12 years together. After the door closed behind him, Sarah sat in the silence of the apartment for a long time, not crying, not calling anyone, just existing in the strange liminal space between her old life and whatever came next. The Meridian deal notification had come through on her work email an hour ago, Robert Chen's message confirming that they were moving forward with the partnership, that contracts would be drafted by the end of the week, that Sarah had just secured the kind of victory that most executives spent their entire careers chasing. She should have been celebrating, should have been on the phone with her team or popping champagne or doing any of the things that people do when they achieve something extraordinary, but instead she was sitting alone in an apartment that no longer felt like home, trying to reconcile the dissonance of succeeding and failing so spectacularly on the same day. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from friends and colleagues, some offering congratulations on the deal, others asking if the rumors about Michael were true, and Sarah ignored them all because she didn't have the energy to perform for anyone right now. She thought about all the signs she must have missed, the late nights that Michael had attributed to difficult clients, the weekends he'd spent supposedly playing golf with business associates, the way he'd stopped asking detailed questions about her work and her day, and she wondered if she'd been willfully blind or just genuinely too focused on her career to notice her marriage disintegrating. The rational part of her brain knew that his affair wasn't her fault, that Michael had made his choices and owned his betrayal, but there was still a nagging voice asking if she'd somehow driven him away by prioritizing her ambition over their relationship. She pulled out her laptop and started going through her calendar for the past 6 months, reconstructing the timeline of her Meridian preparation and Michael's affair, seeing how neatly they'd overlap, how every major milestone in her professional life had coincided with some new escalation in his relationship with Vanessa. The night she'd finalized the initial Meridian proposal, Michael had been at what he'd called a client dinner but was probably with Vanessa. The weekend she'd spent locked in her home office perfecting her financial projections. He'd supposedly been at a consulting conference in San Francisco, but she had no proof he'd actually gone. The pattern was clear once she looked for it, a systematic deception that had been hiding in plain sight while she'd been too consumed by work to question his explanations. What made it worse was that she'd trusted him completely, had never once suspected infidelity despite having friends whose marriages had imploded under similar circumstances, had believed they were different because they'd built their relationship on honesty and mutual support. The betrayal felt particularly cruel because Michael had always presented himself as her biggest cheerleader, the person who celebrated her victories and encouraged her ambitions, and now she had to wonder if that support had been genuine or just a convenient cover for his own activities. Sarah poured herself a glass of wine from a bottle they'd been saving for a special occasion, because what was more special than the simultaneous implosion and triumph of your entire life? And she stood at the window looking out at the city light, thinking about all the other people in those buildings who were probably dealing with their own private disasters, while maintaining public facades of success. The thought that should have been depressing was somehow comforting, the idea that she wasn't unique in her suffering, that the gap between public achievement and private pain was probably the defining characteristic of professional life in the modern world. Sarah showed up at the office the next morning at 7:30, earlier than usual, wearing her armor in the form of a black suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent and makeup that concealed the fact that she'd slept maybe 3 hours. The reaction from her team was immediate and complicated. Congratulations for the Meridian deal, delivered with awkward glances and careful silences about the Michael situation that everyone had clearly read about online. Her assistant Emily brought coffee without being asked and closed the office door behind her with unusual gentleness, a small kindness that almost broke through Sarah's carefully constructed composure. The morning was consumed by logistics calls and contract reviews and strategic planning sessions for the Meridian integration, all the crucial work that happened after a deal closed and the real execution began, and Sarah threw herself into it with an intensity that bordered on manic because work was the only thing that made sense right now. Her phone kept lighting up with messages from reporters requesting comment on her personal situation, from divorce attorneys offering their services, from concerned friends and gleeful enemies, and everyone in between who wanted a piece of her story, and she ignored them all except for a single text to her lawyer, instructing him to begin divorce proceedings immediately. The news cycle had already moved on to its next scandal, but the damage to her privacy was permanent, her marriage's implosion now permanently searchable online, fodder for gossip sites and corporate rumor mills. During a break between meetings, Sarah searched for articles about Michael and found that he'd released a statement through his company's PR firm, a carefully worded non-apology that expressed regret for any hurt caused while conspicuously avoiding any actual admission of wrongdoing. The statement mentioned his relationship with Vanessa in the vaguest possible terms, describing it as a professional connection that had evolved into something personal, and Sarah felt a fresh wave of anger at his cowardice, his inability to even own his choices publicly. She learned from Jennifer, who'd heard from David, that Michael had already moved in with Vanessa, that they were apparently planning to get an apartment together once Sarah's lawyer finished negotiating the divorce settlement, and the speed of it all felt like another betrayal, like he'd been so ready to start his new life that he'd had it planned out before he'd even ended the old one. The afternoon brought a meeting with her CEO and board members to discuss the Meridian deal's implications, and Sarah presented her integration strategy with the same precision and confidence she'd shown to the Meridian executives, refusing to give anyone reason to question whether her personal drama would affect her professional performance. One of the board members, an older man who'd been skeptical of her promotion to EVP 2 years ago, made a comment about her needing time off to handle personal matters, and Sarah shut him down with a surgical precision that left no ambiguity about her intention. She wasn't taking time off, wasn't letting Michael's betrayal derail the career she'd spent 15 years building, wasn't going to be the cautionary tale about women who let personal problems compromise their professional standing. After the meet, Sarah's CEO pulled her aside and offered support in the form of additional resources for the Meridian integration, acknowledgement that she was dealing with unprecedented circumstances, and Sarah appreciated the gesture even as she declined most of the help because accepting it felt like admitting weakness. The rest of the day blurred into conference calls and document reviews and strategic discussion, the familiar rhythms of corporate work that served as both distraction and validation, proof that she was more than just someone's soon-to-be ex-wife, that she'd built an identity and a career that existed independent of her failed marriage. 2 weeks after Michael moved out, Sarah started going through their joint financial records with the methodical attention she usually reserved for corporate audits, and what she found made the affair seem almost quaint by comparison. Hidden within their shared accounts and investment portfolios was a pattern of transactions that told a story Michael definitely hadn't wanted her to discover, thousands of dollars in unexplained withdrawals and transfers that dated back almost a year. She traced the money through bank statements and credit card records, following the trail with growing disbelief, as she uncovered charges for jewelry she'd never received, hotel rooms during weeks when Michael claimed to be working from home, and restaurant bills from places she'd never been. The amounts weren't devastating individually, but they added up to a significant portion of their savings, money that Michael had been systematically siphoning off to fund his relationship with Vanessa, while Sarah had been working herself to exhaustion. What made it worse was discovering that he'd taken out a personal loan using their home as collateral, something that required her signature but which he'd apparently forged, a federal crime that transformed his betrayal from merely personal to actually criminal. Sarah sat in her home office staring at the loan documents until the numbers blurred, trying to understand what kind of person she'd been married to, what combination of entitlement and desperation would drive someone to commit fraud against their own spouse. She called her lawyer immediately, sent him digital copies of everything she'd found, and listened to his sharp intake of breath as he reviewed the evidence and explained that this changed everything about their divorce proceedings. Michael hadn't just cheated, hadn't just fallen in love with someone else, he'd been actively stealing from their joint assets to finance his affair, and now Sarah had grounds for a divorce settlement that would leave him with far less than the 50-50 split he'd probably been expecting. The discovery triggered something in Sarah that transcended anger or hurt, a cold, calculating fury that she usually reserved for hostile business negotiations, and she began compiling a comprehensive dossier of Michael's financial misconduct with the same attention to detail she'd bring to a corporate investigation. She found evidence that he'd been using their shared credit cards to buy gifts for Vanessa, that he'd charged romantic getaways to their accounts, that he'd been living a double life on her dime, while she'd been too focused on her career to notice the financial irregularities. Her forensic accounting uncovered that Michael had also been inflating his business expenses and pocketing the reimbursements, a scheme he'd apparently been running for at least 2 years, stealing from his own consulting firm in addition to stealing from their marriage. Sarah forwarded this evidence to David, Michael's business partner, with a simple note explaining what she'd found and suggesting he might want to conduct his own audit. The response came within hours, David calling her directly to express his shock and gratitude, explaining that he'd suspected something was off, but hadn't wanted to believe his partner was capable of embezzlement. The conversation revealed additional context Sarah hadn't known, that Michael's relationship with Vanessa had started as a harassment situation that she'd reported to HR before Michael had somehow convinced her to drop the complaint, suggesting a pattern of manipulation and boundary violations that made Sarah question everything she thought she knew about the man she'd married. By the time she finished her investigation, Sarah had assembled enough evidence to bury Michael in both civil and criminal court, documentation that would likely end his career and possibly put him in prison, and she sat with that power for a long time, considering her options and weighing revenge against pragmatism. Sarah met with her attorney in his downtown office on a Tuesday afternoon, the Meridian integration now in full swing, and her professional life more demanding than ever, but she'd carved out this time because the divorce needed to be handled strategically, and she refused to let Michael walk away from their marriage without consequences. But she'd carved out this time because the divorce needed to be handled strategically, and she refused to let Michael walk away from their marriage without consequences. She could pursue criminal charges for the forged signature on the home equity loan, could report the business expense fraud to the authorities, could make Michael's life a legal nightmare that would consume years and potentially destroy him completely, or she could use the evidence as leverage to negotiate a divorce settlement, so favorable that he'd have no choice but to accept whatever terms she offered. Sarah listened to the options while watching the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, thinking about the woman she'd been 6 months ago who would have been horrified by the idea of weaponizing the legal system against someone she'd once loved, and recognizing that woman was gone, replaced by someone harder and more pragmatic who understood that mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford. The attorney recommended a combination approach using the threat of criminal prosecution to force Michael into an immediate settlement that would give Sarah the penthouse, the majority of their joint assets, and a structure that would leave him with just enough to start over but not enough to feel like he'd gotten away with anything. She would also require him to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement preventing him from discussing their marriage or her career in any public forum, a legal gag order that would protect her privacy and prevent him from selling his story to whatever gossip outlet would pay for it. The settlement would include a clause requiring Michael to resign from his consulting firm and forfeit his partnership stake, Sarah's revenge gift to David, who'd been a genuinely good friend throughout this disaster, and provisions that would block Michael from working in their industry for at least 3 years. It was a scorched earth approach that would essentially reset his career to zero. But Sarah felt no guilt about it because he'd made his choices and now he could live with the consequences. Her lawyer asked if she wanted to pursue criminal charges anyway, and Sarah considered it seriously, imagining Michael in prison orange, and finding that the fantasy gave her less satisfaction than she'd expected. The point wasn't punishment for its own sake, the point was ensuring he couldn't hurt her, or anyone else again, and she could accomplish that goal more effectively through the civil settlement than through criminal prosecution. She instructed her attorney to draw up the papers and deliver them to Michael with a 72-hour deadline, explaining that if he didn't sign immediately, she would go to the police and the State Bar Association and anyone else who might be interested in his various frauds. The message would be clear: take the deal or face complete destruction, no negotiation and no second chances. Sarah signed the authorization papers with a sense of finality, ending not just her marriage but the last remaining connection to the person she'd been before the Meridian deal, and Michael's betrayal had transformed her into someone new. Walking out of the attorney's office, she felt lighter than she had in weeks, the decision made and the path forward clear, no longer trapped in the uncertainty of what to do about her imploded marriage. Her phone buzzed with a message from her CEO asking for a dinner meeting to discuss the next phase of the Meridian integration, and Sarah confirmed immediately, grateful for the distraction of work and the validation of being valued for her professional capabilities rather than her personal drama. Michael signed the divorce papers. 3 days later, his attorney delivering them to Sarah's lawyer without comment or counter-proposal, and just like that her marriage was over, reduced to a legal document that would be filed with the county clerk and processed like any other piece of administrative paperwork. The Meridian integration was ahead of schedule, Sarah's team executing the deployment plan with the precision of a military operation, and industry publications were running features about her leadership and strategic vision that never once mentioned her divorce. She'd moved past being the woman whose husband left her for his secretary and become simply the executive who'd closed the biggest deal of the year, her professional identity reasserting itself as the dominant narrative. The penthouse felt different now that it was entirely hers, no longer a shared space with compromised furniture and negotiated aesthetics, and Sarah had started the process of redecorating it to reflect her own taste rather than their former couple identity. She'd thrown out the wedding photos and the anniversary gifts and all the other accumulated artifacts of 12 years together, creating physical space that matched the emotional distance she'd established. Jennifer came over one evening with wine and takeout, the first purely social visit Sarah had allowed since everything imploded, and they sat on the balcony watching the sunset, while Jennifer asked the obvious question about how Sarah was really doing beneath the professional success and the strategic divorce victory. Sarah thought about it seriously before answering, acknowledging that she was angry and hurt and would probably be processing the betrayal for years, but also recognizing that she felt more authentically herself than she had in a long time, no longer performing the role of supportive wife or balancing someone else's needs against her own ambitions. The divorce had been devastating, but it had also been clarifying, stripping away the comfortable lies she'd been telling herself about having a balanced life and revealing the truth that she was fundamentally someone who found meaning and purpose in professional achievement. Jennifer asked if Sarah regretted how hard she'd worked on the Meridian deal, if she thought focusing less on her career might have saved her marriage, and Sarah laughed because the question itself revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Michael hadn't cheated because she'd worked too hard, he'd cheated because he was selfish and entitled and had wanted the validation of a younger woman's attention, and nothing Sarah could have done differently would have changed that essential character flaw. If anything, her professional success had probably just accelerated the timeline of his betrayal by making him feel inadequate and resentful rather than proud. She told Jennifer about the financial fraud and the forged documents and all the evidence of systematic deception that had nothing to do with Sarah's work schedule and everything to do with Michael's willingness to prioritize his own desires over basic morality. They talked until the city lights fully illuminated the darkness, processing the reality that sometimes people you trust completely turn out to be strangers wearing familiar faces, and that the only rational response was to build a life that didn't depend on anyone else's integrity. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, Sarah accepted a promotion to Chief Strategy Officer, a newly created position that put her in direct line for the CEO role when the current executive retired in 5 years, and she celebrated by taking her team to an expensive restaurant and giving a toast about resilience and adaptation, and refusing to let personal setbacks define professional trajectory. The Meridian partnership was generating results that exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections, proving that her strategic vision had been sound and her execution had been flawless, validation that mattered more than any marriage ever could. She'd started dating again, casually and without expectations, meeting people through friends and work connections and discovering that she actually enjoyed the process of getting to know someone new without the weight of shared history and accumulated resentment. Life had become something she was building intentionally rather than something that was happening to her, each decision a conscious choice about the person she wanted to be and the future she wanted to create. And if that future looked different from what she'd imagined 12 years ago when she'd married Michael, it also looked clearer and more honest and entirely her own.